All right, good morning, everyone. We're just going to give people another minute to join and then we will get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Annika, and I am the Public Affairs Coordinator at the Digital Supercluster, and I am pleased to welcome you today to our webinar, IP Strategies to Enable Scale-Ups. Before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge that in Canada, we live, work, and learn on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral land of Indigenous people. And as myself and much of the Supercluster team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we are gathered here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And we encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge and let us know in the chat the traditional territory that you are joining us from. If at any point during the session you have a question, please type it into the Q&A chat and we'll address them towards the end of the session. I'd now like to hand it over to Jen, our IP manager at the Supercluster.
Thank you, Annika. Bonjour, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to have so many of you joining in from across the country in what is the fourth installment of the IP Focus series we've planned for this year. Whether you're new to the Supercluster or a returning face, we're thrilled that you could join us for this Power Hour. IP is an essential tool for entrepreneurs, and the supports in securing, accessing, and using IP to commercialize and grow their businesses paramount to thriving and becoming competitive within the landscape of the knowledge economy. Yet investments in intellectual property can often seem to take years to result in meaningful impact. Now more than ever, organizations need to understand their freedom to operate and business differentiating strategies through various stages, whether at the onset of launching new products or services, raising a funding round, financing round, or more generally minimizing litigation risks. Over these next 60 minutes, we'll cover items that include reducing infringement risk, FTO lessons learned, charting your multi-year strategy and IP maturity, and knowing if your FTO plans are right-sized, along with a Q&A portion to close us out. Next slide, please. A foundational component of the Supercluster is collaborative innovation, setting the framework for projects that address cross-industry challenges while creating technology products that scale across industries and ultimately across the world. The Digital Supercluster's IP strategy supports the development, ownership, and retention of Canadian IP through a number of vehicles, and informational sessions with industry thought leaders like we've today are but one example of that. Next slide, please. I've the pleasure of introducing today's panel. Please join me in welcoming Peter Cowan, Mike McLean, and Graeme Herring. Peter is the principal consultant at Northworks IP and CEO advisor at Innovation Asset Collective. Northworks IP is an IP strategy advisory firm that was founded to help companies maximize the value of their IP assets through a business-focused approach to IP. He has 20 years of experience in IP strategy, and for the past 7 has worked as a senior consultant for various SMEs, multinationals, and venture firms around the globe to help them make improved strategic and licensing decisions about their IP assets and investments. He has deep technical experience and is a named inventor on at least 70 patents in the clean energy sector. Mike is the CEO of the Innovation Asset Collective, an organization helping Canadian data-driven clean tech companies maximize the value of their intangible assets to provide leverage for businesses to scale and to build capacity in the Canadian IP ecosystem. Before joining IAC, Mike was the Senior Vice President of IP Services at Tech Insights, where he founded the Patent Development Service and established a center of excellence around patent portfolio management and patent assessments. His practice enables data-driven decision-making and effective identification of patent assets for enforcement or sale, provides guidance on invention selection and patent acquisition programs, and ensures the alignment of patent portfolios with IP and business strategy. Mike has worked extensively with the technology practices of major law firms, in-house corporate counsel teams of global technology companies, as well as external licensing agencies. And last but certainly not least, Graeme, Vice President of Intellectual Property Strategy at Terramera, a Vancouver-based global ag tech leader focused on the transformation of how food is grown and the economics of agriculture through solutions using science, nature, and artificial intelligence. Graeme works closely with Terramera's R&D and commercial teams to lead the development of Terramera's IP portfolio and leveraging IP to advantage in executing its business plan. He has over 20 years of experience in managing intellectual property strategy and building IP portfolios for R&D companies. Prior to joining Terramera, he led in-house IP teams for leading companies in both clean tech and software. And as a director and registered patent agent as a specialist law firm, he counseled many small and medium-sized technology companies on their IP strategy and built and prosecuted their global patent portfolios. We are most certainly in for a treat this morning and this afternoon, wherever you're joining us from, with these gentlemen. And without further ado, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you to Mike and Graeme for joining us. Just a bit of intro today. Maybe I can facilitate a conversation between the three of us. We can have a bit of a casual chat. There'll be no slides, but looking forward just to have a conversation around IP and scale-ups. Really interested in we have some startups and early stage companies here today. Hopefully the takeaways for them will be what they need to be prepared for as they grow, and some potential scale up. So giving them a snapshot into what they need to be thinking about as they move to their next stage. So Mike and Graeme, maybe I can start off and set the stage a little bit today and talk about, and have you talk a little bit about, from your perspective and what you've seen in the industry, Mike working with companies and Graeme being part of a scaling company. What are some of the lessons learned that from your view that companies have had to sit through as they've tried to scale, where kind of IP has played an important role for them, or maybe even played a role where it caused their scale up to essentially stop. So interested to get your thoughts on that.
Graeme, do you want to kick off?
Sure. I also wanted to extend my thanks to the Digital Technology Supercluster for hosting this, and to my co-panelists as well, Mike and Peter. Certainly, IP strategy is important at all stages of a company, but in particular, there are so many things to do and so many pressing priorities at the startup and scale-up phase that it really takes a moment or two of planning to be able to figure out what are the most important priorities for your company and IP strategy, and to be able to make sure that those move ahead and help establish a foundation for the company's IP success in the midst of all the other priorities that are going on at the same time. I think for my background, certainly one of the things that is essential to determining what approach to IP strategy you may want to take is the context of the industry that you're and the technology area that your company plays in. Understanding what the direction that your business plan is aimed at, how you're going to need to interact with other entities, small and large, and what stage the technology industry in your area is at. At the extreme ends of the spectrum, you might see in one area a highly developed technology space like telecommunications or something like that, where there's vast IP asset portfolios in the hands of many large players, where cross-licensing of complex intellectual property pools is commonplace, and you're looking to integrate solutions. In those cases, you're going to have to focus a lot of your effort on understanding the access to IP, the licensing implications, and freedom to operate as a way of ensuring that your integrated solution is going to be able to to enter the marketplace. On the flip side, if you're working on developing a great sort of blue sky technology coming straight out of R&D in an area where the technology hasn't existed before, or where the application is completely new, you may be looking at a very different set of IP priorities established around ensuring that you have a foundation for protecting the core benefits of your technology, and that foundation is broad enough to capture the fact that your understanding and technology path is going to change as the company evolves and grows.
Thanks.
Great points. I would just add to that a few few examples or use cases on where to start. I was exposed to a technology company about 10 or 12 years ago that was building out a new component technology, but one they felt was really going to make a difference in the market, had competitive advantage. There was a number of market incumbents. One in particular had a very dominant patent position and was known for enforcing those patent rights aggressively. The risk that came up, though, with this company was not a direct assertion from that party. However, as they went to market and as they were trying to sell their product and their technology, every potential customer raised that patent position as an obstacle. And when that was asking, was there a license? Was there a right to practice? Have you addressed these assets over here in order for us to incorporate your technology into our end product? Because we don't want to have to deal with it after the fact. And eventually they had to completely pivot the business because that market was blocked for them. And it wasn't a direct assertion that was the block. It was the threat of that assertion and the knowledge in the marketplace of the potential of that. On the flip side, if you look at a business that understands their environment at a greater level of detail, both in terms of the technology and the more standard business competition, but also how does IP layer into that? How do the various IP positions impact your ability to sell successfully? And what aspects of your own product, your own technology, are you going to be able to secure and really own? And understanding of those options, what makes a difference in the marketplace, right? What am I going to be able to make money from? What's going to drive value for my customers? And can I secure and build an ownership position around that? That's where companies really start to gain leverage and gain the ability to scale, because they've created that ownership position. They've understand how IP rights can layer into the business versus thinking of it from a more granular or technology-driven perspective.
It's really interesting. And Mike, maybe if I can ask you a follow-up, you talked about, layering the IP rights into the business. And I think for more mature companies, that's where we see it. My question would be is, from your perspective, what does that look like? Like, from the executive level and maybe even the manager or the board level, and how does that differ? And what in your mind is a differentiation between a company that is scaling and gets it and one that doesn't get it? If I can compare and contrast a little bit. And Graeme, I'd love your thoughts on that as well.
So maybe I'll start at the doesn't get it standpoint, or what we more commonly see. I think there's three scenarios we see most commonly. First, is a simple statement of we're treating everything as trade secrets. We deal, all of our conversations are under NDA, so we're protected. That's a common situation. Second situation is we've filed a provisional patent around our core invention. We're protected. Again, no, in both cases, no thought of overall, what is the business about? How are you going to make money? What pieces of that are important for you to own longer term? What are my options around that ownership? You will see kind of a next step up where people understand they need to build a collection of assets and build an overall position. But the strategy is a filing strategy of what countries are important to me. Should I be filing patents in China or Japan or Germany versus Canada and the United States? That's kind of the next level of progression. But again, that's not thinking about your business in a strategic way and how your IP strategy should link into that. So those are, I think, the most common scenarios that we've seen, both in my time at IAC and my time dealing with companies before that. When we look at what ideally we would see is a company that's thought through, we have this innovation or multiple innovations. We are bringing those to market in this way. Our value proposition or our competitive differentiation is A, B, and C. And the other competitors, whether they be the large market incumbents or other startups in the area, here's what they're bringing to market and here's how we're different. But also an understanding of, well, here's the IP positions related to those products. Here's the gaps in those, and here's the pieces of what we do that we can secure. So there's kind of some intersection points in a Venn diagram there. And at the core of that is really the center of your IP strategy of market opportunity, competitive dynamics, and the IP position you're going to be able to build. And then establishing a plan to execute against that and build that out over time. Right? Oftentimes, companies will jump to strategy as this end goal that's 5 years out or 10 years out, and no thought about what are the steps that are going to need to be taken over that time to get there. So that's where we see an ideal build out of IP strategy and building of an IP position for a company that's beginning to scale.
Yeah. And Graeme, maybe from your perspective, who in the organization has a voice in that? Like, job, is it R&D? Is it the commercial team, the sales team? Like, where in your mind do really mature companies actually have the IP discussions that Mike's talking about?
Excellent question and great points Mike made. I think that's something that I've found the real core way to assure that you're taking as balanced and effective approach to your IP strategy as possible is to recognize that it has to reflect all of the priorities and goals of the business and the technology development path. And the higher level that you can have that interaction at and have an understanding at, the more effective that ability to build IP strategy that leads and supports the technical and business development of the company can be. Ideally, certainly you need representation both from and consultation both from the business and the technology side. But when you are truly fortunate is when you're able to have not just information and consultation, but actually understanding and prioritization across that level. So we're talking people like from the CSO and CTO, but also the president of a person responsible for business development, certainly person responsible for partnerships and go to market. Ideally, even when the CEO and the board have IP strategy as a core part of their understanding of what will help the business succeed and scale, then you're in the position of trying to take a really comprehensive integrated view from the whole company. I'll say that that's one of the real blessings I've been very fortunate to work with the entire management team at Terramera, is that the entire company sees intellectual property as a priority goal of the company. And that means that those conversations are a lot easier to have. In other cases, the case I think needs to be built from the people who are working with intellectual property, preferably across multiple units. The case needs to be built to push understanding and encourage understanding in the rest of the company to ensure that those considerations are taken into account when you're coming up with an IP strategy, not just did you file a patent this quarter. Wanted to pick up just on one point that Mike also made about understanding the ways you layer intellectual property into the conversation, and the strategy has to be forward-looking in terms of not just 5 years from now, but where do we move in terms of steps to get there. One of the ways I found very helpful to have that conversation be part of the business and technical planning of the company is not look at how are we going to build IP blocks, building blocks alongside the development of technology and business, but even more, what do we want to plan in terms of intellectual property assets and portfolios and different types of IP. In other words, there should be an IP development path that's similar or akin to a product development path, that you're looking at what are the types of assets we're going to want, or going to need, what type of IP rights are going to enable us to engage particular partners that we see are going to be critical to building success and scaling the company, whether it's through distribution or R&D partnerships, and look to put in place the plans to have those IP assets be built in the same strategic way that you would be looking at how are we going to develop the next generation of our product.
Yeah, I maybe add,
go ahead, Mike.
Just jump into that one further point, and it talks to the type of people Graeme just mentioned being involved in the conversation. There was an article published last year in one of our national papers where someone was arguing that the focus on intellectual property is short-sighted. Where Canada really falls down is a lack of selling around the commercialization of innovation, and that we need to put more emphasis and more effort around the selling of the technology, not the protecting of the technology. And to me, it's not an either-or conversation. You absolutely need both, and you need both of those parties talking together and coordinating. To best protect IP, you need to have an understanding of what's resonating in the market, what aspects of the technology is attractive to customers. That's got to feed in from the sales and marketing teams into the IP function. On the flip side, way easier to sell and market differentiated proprietary products than one that's commoditized and that or is readily copied by other people. So those things really feed off and reinforce each other. And it's that more sophisticated conversation is what really we want to get companies thinking about is how do these pieces support and build off each other so that business can get.
I would certainly wholeheartedly agree with that. I think also there's different parts of the innovation ecosystem in Canada, but a big part of what Canadian companies who are scaling are looking at is they may not be the sole direct access to the market that they're looking for. They may be working with partners and many partners, and that it doesn't matter if you protect it if you can't sell it. I would argue that certainly my experience and the experience of a lot of people I've spoken to that are really trying to make IP strategy a priority is that when you have built an IP estate that has proprietary rights that are at the core of what differentiates and captures the value of the technology you're developing, it makes it an awful lot easier to execute those sales and those partnerships and those deals in a way that gives you access to the markets or the customers or the partnership development paths that matter, and so it doesn't sell for you. And certainly there's no such thing as a technology that sells itself, but it gives you the ability to negotiate those sales in a way that does reflect recognition of value. And so I would argue that a better intellectual property strategy will make Canadian innovation-based companies more effective at being able to sell.
For sure. Thanks. I apologize. I think my Zoom paused me for 5 seconds, so I might have missed something. I'll maybe make I want to follow on one or two comments, and maybe we can jump forward and talk about reducing infringement risk and how that's part of a strategy. But maybe 2 points. I think, Graeme, you talked a bit about the CEO and the board and the top down being a key support for you, and I've seen that as well in many of the companies I've worked with. Maybe just two pieces of interest. The Canadian Council of Innovators has an innovation governance program, and we talk a lot about, we're talking a lot about we need to, as part of IAC, we need to, educate companies, but there's also a group of board members or directors that also need educated when it comes to IP, because again, support comes from the top down. So CCI has innovation governance program, and I know Mike, you were one of the speakers on it last year on IP governance and data governance. So there is resources out there, which is great to see. And maybe Jen can pop that in the chat to them. And I think too, I think Mike, to some of your comments around, building an IP program and building a portfolio, there was an article that I was doing some research for today. There was an article in the Globe and Mail last year from Sonos and about Sonos, and it talked a lot about, Sonos, which was founded in 2002, but they brought a new CEO in 2012. And between 2012 and 2020, they essentially went from, I think, 10 patents to about 3,000 patents. And that acquisition, or whether it was acquisition or growth, really helped them set up to compete against Google. Sonos had a pretty big market cap when they were competing against Google, about $3 billion, but Google has about a 1.8 or $2 trillion market cap, right? So huge difference, right? So even companies that have scaled from the top down, when you read the article, it's very evident that they put IP in at the CEO level and the board level, and they weave that into their strategic discussions. Mike, you talked about, in your example, really trying to figure out, where you can, making sure you're not blocked. Whereas when I read through the Sonos article that's in the Globe and Mail, it talks about they understood where everyone was going, and they actually went and made sure they could block somebody should they, want to sell more products. So really interesting perspective. I would really encourage everyone to read the article. My big takeaway from the article is IP is a long game. If you read the article, the timeline is it's talked about it over a 10-year period. This is not a 2-year discussion, it's a 10-year discussion. So just some thoughts on that. Maybe Mike and Graeme, we can shift a little bit and interested to get some tangible examples or strategic advice you'd have for companies that, actually want to reduce their infringement risk today, things they can do for their risk mitigation or asset generation, in the next year or two, or start to get set up with their infrastructure, keeping in mind you want to scale long term. But, what do we do and how do we, give advice to them today?
So a range of practices that companies can use, and a lot of it depends on the nature of the technology and the business and the markets they're in. As Graeme mentioned earlier, there are some technologies, some marketplaces like telecom that are incredibly IP dense, and the volumes of IP are significant. So the first thing is really understanding what type of product you have and the density of IP that is relevant to what you're doing. So that would be step number one. Step number two is looking at the diversity of your product or technologies. Right. So if all of your revenue is coming from a single product, then your risk is much higher than if you had a more diverse set of products with different technologies. 5-10% of revenue from any one product area, that risk profile is very different for those type of companies. So understanding your risk profile based on revenue concentration, I think would be another piece. Once you understand those two things, you can look at the avenues available for you to evaluate the specifics of the risk in that space, right? There's patent landscaping work or freedom to operate type studies where you investigate the relevant patent holdings that cover the technologies where you're operating, understand who holds those patents and what type of threats they hold. Is there a lot of litigation in the space, other relevant information about enforcement of patent rights relevant to those technologies? So those types of studies can be helpful. You again want to scale the investment or the effort put into those to the revenue that potentially is exposed and to the level of risk. So a lot of different ways to do those. They can be quite simple efforts for $5,000 or $10,000, or those studies can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the number of assets and the amount of time and effort you put into them. So scale appropriately. The other piece is looking at how can you build your own position to access the rights that provide you coverage or can counterbalance a third-party position. So that is your own organic build, and early stage companies can do that at a certain pace. And as you grow, you'll be able to afford to file more patents, potentially afford to buy third-party patents. And then are there collective approaches or group approaches that can be brought to bear? There's commercial businesses that deal in managing risk. Some of those are insurance products. Some of those are joint defense type of businesses. We're a not-for-profit that provides that to our membership, and that we're building a collective patent portfolio that our members can access if they need defensive assets. So there's a number of different avenues available to companies to explore as they look to manage the risk from third-party IP.
Okay.
Excellent points. I would add, I think that Mike's comments about scaling the amount of time and effort you spend on risk mitigation, like by looking for freedom to operate, really does need to reflect the gauge the business is at and the potential benefit from it. There is an ability to spend all of your time and effort looking at other people's IP, particularly if you're in an IP heavy space, which can make it very difficult to come up with a solution to how are you going to be able to get your technology into the market where it needs to be. I think balancing the stage that you're at and the options that you have for technology development with the approach you use can be very, very important. Certainly at the earlier stages, in our experience, one of the ways we try to bring this to planning the direction for growing technology development in the company is to use intellectual property as a lens to focus the technology. We're looking to at a space and say we need a solution that does something like this. What are the technology paths we can use to get there? By looking at intellectual property in those areas and who's owning that IP and what the likelihood is to be able to either avoid it or successfully access rights to that IP, that can help guide our technology development path so that we are choosing directions where we see open space or freedom to operate or accessible rights, or even better, we choose places where we think that we can build those rights from the ground up, where we're really free of as much constraint in terms of IP for others. So really looking for dead ends or blockings that IP rights can present later in the development path. Looking at those earlier when you're choosing the approach you're going to use to look for technological solutions can really help guide that, so that you'll be able to build broader assets, own more of the rights, and avoid being in a corner where your only option is to access rights or risk infringement from other people that are established in the space.
Thanks. And it maybe a bit of a follow-up for both of you, get your thoughts on, I know, Mike, you talked about it earlier, about, you know, the company that wanted to sell into a market, but their customers were concerned. Bit of a secondary question, that most large companies, as you get to a certain stage, have many joint ventures, lots of collaboration. I know with the digital supercluster, there's obviously collaboration going on. So interested to get both your thoughts on, knowing that a company has to grow and eventually they're going to be partnering with, you know, collaborators. How would your IP strategy at early stages, how do you think that influences what you should be doing now, what you want to build now, how your strategy might adjust now? Again, knowing you're going to have to do partnerships down the road. Maybe I can open the floor to both of you on that.
I can offer just a quick thought. Definitely, when you know that partnerships are going to be important and you have some idea of the people of the partners that you're going to want to or need to work with, both for the benefit of being prepared for those discussions and planning as much as you can in your own IP strategy for how you would engage those partners, but also, like you said, Peter, the example where you're looking to assure investors or customers, is to be aware of the intellectual property position of the companies you're looking for. You shouldn't just be looking who you need to meet at a conference in business development. You should be looking at what patents they own, what their key inventors are working on, what their key inventors are presenting at, where the technology and IP direction of that prospective partner is. That'll give you a better ability to understand what rights they're going to be touchy about, what rights they may be missing, or that you are particularly going to be able to key on offering them as an addition to just the pure market benefit of your technology or product. I find that preparation step is really important to, you know, satisfy that we're ready to engage with a partner, but also to help open the door to understanding what the direction that negotiation is likely to go and where you're likely to see sensitivity points or demands from a partner. One other aspect in relation to the balance between risk, FTO, and positive asserting rights that you have is that in those discussions with partners, typically having more experience working on the small company side, you're often put in the position of being asked to give assurances, whether that's contractually in terms of contractual obligations, representations, and warranties, or rather just in terms of convincing the partner that you in fact will be able to execute on the opportunity that you're proposing to them. We found that by focusing on making sure that we're aware of how our rights can protect what we're offering, and having done our best job of filing and establishing patent rights or other types of IP rights on the technology that we're working with, really can help by offering license or access to affirmative rights that we own. That can make it a lot easier to satisfy a partner that you're in a position to be able to offer what you're proposing in terms of a joint relationship, as opposed to being on the back foot particularly for a small company, where you're being asked to make representations that put a lot of onus or obligation and financial risk on the small party.
Yeah, and Mike, how would you think about advising companies as they're with their IP strategies now, knowing they're going to be going into joint ventures and have to do collaborations and want to have that protected or have a lever?
I think it's important to have an understanding of the landscape, creating a framework so you can evaluate technology in one dimension and product or revenue stream in another, and understand where your current and future IP positions land within that landscape and where the others within your environment land. Yeah. And that's going to help you understand, as you look to engage in that ecosystem, right? There's going to be competitors where you need to understand how does your position stack up against theirs, and are you going to be at a disadvantage or advantage? there's going to be gaps in your technology offering that you need to fill to complete a given product, and who has that technology and who has that IP, so that you can engage them on an insourcing basis. On the flip side, there's other people that have gaps that maybe you're going to be filling. And how do you identify that, and having a framework to evaluate those things against on a more consistent basis, I think is quite useful. At an earlier stage where maybe you don't have things built out quite to that extent, and you're looking at selling technology going in, you need help developing it, you've got an idea. What are the simple things you could put in place, either at least contractually, if not in terms of securing a patent or other IP right, to give yourself some protection at an early stage, that as you engage in conversations, you don't risk losing that technology to other parties.
That's great. So maybe with the last 5-7 minutes before we jump to some questions, we may ask some kind of a next stage question. And we talked about strategies and direction today. IP is a bit of a long game, thinking through, doing things today that are going to help you down the road. So maybe I can get both your thoughts, and I can share mine as well, on kind of the timing and how you would right size a company today. Like if you were dropped into a company that had CEO and board support to build an IP program, what are some of the pieces and variables that you would really start to think about and make sure, kind of boots on the ground, nuts and bolts, so to say, that would be put into place? And I'll maybe go first. I think about talent, making sure there's the right team in place, whether it's internal or external. I also think about things like resources, and when it comes to budgeting and growth plans and timeline, but and I can expand those later, but maybe get your thoughts on the right sizing piece and how a company should prepare to grow their IP program as they scale.
Graeme, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I think that it's always difficult to carve out budget for an IP program, particularly when, like you said, Peter, a lot of the time the real benefit is going to be seen significantly down the road, at least in terms of having assets mature so that you actually have granted rights and things like that. But that being said, there are a lot of ways that at an earlier stage you can prepare for the need to be able to scale IP strategy and IP resources, while trying to maintain that on a less of a dedicated budget size basis. One thing I think that companies often are not as proactive at, and certainly no one is as proactive as they can be, but is that for looking for finding people with an understanding of IP for positions across the technical and business side of the company during hiring, and building that understanding and expertise in-house. The money spent on hiring an advisor or a strategist to do a particular project for you may be significantly more than it would be to ask for someone to help educate your entire workforce and raise their level of IP understanding and awareness. And then you have people working on all your projects that have a higher level of appreciation for how IP needs to be included in their planning, points at which they should be thinking specifically about making sure that IP is taken account of, and that opportunities for building assets are taken. Also, I think that identifying somebody in the company who is at the appropriate level and connection with the business and the technical sides, that really has IP as a primary part of their role. And this doesn't always mean hiring lawyers or patent people specifically, but having someone who has an aptitude, an interest, and a significant part of their purpose is to be facilitating that in-house. Many companies have used concepts like patent engineers or IP analysts that have other roles in business or technology, but that really have, even at an early stage of a company, a key responsibility for IP, and very importantly, support from the executive and the board level of the company for that being a priority. That's a way you can start building those resources within existing budgets, with the intent that once you're able to establish those initial steps, you should be looking to dedicate resources specifically to IP portfolio development, risk assessment, and making sure that there's enough expertise on the team, and as well as outside assistance.
Before you go, Mike, just one comment. I see actually the patent engineer title in Europe a lot. it's a kind of a formal role and a formal understanding. I think that's one thing that is done a little bit informally in Canada, but it'd be great to see more people step up and be trained in that aspect.
So a lot of similarities to Graeme's points as I would look to kick that off. Like you're starting with people and processes. Do you have clear delineation of who's doing what with respect to IP, and ideally someone defined as leading that effort, and then start to build up the processes to enable that activity to happen in a consistent basis. Yeah. Next layer up, I think you start to look at your agreements, your employment agreements, your NDAs, partnership agreements, etc., making sure you have consistent terms and understanding of where you want to negotiate, what are absolutes for you, building out consistent practice there. Then I would build out an understanding of what IP do we currently own, what IP rights do we have, what technology that underlays that potentially is protected, what data do we have, can we build an inventory or at least an understanding of what that is at a certain level of detail. Because at the next step, which is beginning to build out into the business, the strategy piece that we've talked about earlier, understanding how is the business competing, what technology or products are they looking to sell, how are they selling them, what is the competitive market dynamic, what is the IP dynamic. All of that sort of builds that competitive framework. You need an understanding of what's your starting point. So if you look at, we want to get to endpoint X, we're starting at point A. All right, now we know sort of what we need to build and start to build out a plan to get there. So I'd start slowly, build up, but eventually you need to get to building a strategy and a working plan to move you forward. When we work with our members, we talk about an IP maturity index. Right, so you're starting really at a basic or foundational level, and how do you build your way through that and evolve your practices so you become world class and can use your IP to really help drive the business forward.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe I can ask a bit of a same question, but from a different view, from kind of a policy perspective. I know we've got we've talked a little bit about this in the past, Mike, with you and I, around how government groups and incubators and accelerators can actually help companies with this. Interested to get your thoughts on, after being through IAC the past year, your thoughts on what the government's doing well. I know we have some great programs through the GAC and IAC obviously, and where we can collaborate and improve. And Graeme, I'd love to get your thoughts from a corporate perspective as to, been there, done that. What could you have used had you had no team and had to scale up for supports in the ecosystem, whether it's government or non-government? Is interested from that perspective.
So I think there's two sets of issues that are different issue sets, but impact the end solution. So there's an issue set relevant to the problems faced by small and medium-sized enterprises in this country. And we see 3, maybe 4 issues at different levels of detail. First is cost, right? It's expensive to participate in this IP business. Assets cost a lot to file with government agencies. The experts and professionals needed to go through that are expensive. So there's a cost barrier to taking on this type of activity. There's a scarcity of talent that understands the complexity of these issues and knows how to implement the right solutions. Canada is traditionally a very resource-based or financial services-based economy, and the IP-dense businesses tend to be headquartered elsewhere, and the IP decisions are made elsewhere in the world. So that buildup of knowledge and experience, there's not a real dense group of people with that background. There are great examples of some knowledge in the country, but the overall talent pool is shallow. And the final piece is the time issue, right? It takes time to build portfolios that will allow companies to stand on their own feet and be self-sustaining in terms of how they engage the marketplace. So policies or programs that address those 3 problems within SMEs, I think are really important. So you're talking about funding, you're talking about education and training, and you're talking about access to assets or tools that help bridge that gap from I'm a brand new company to I'm self-sustaining, whether that's access to patent rights, access to software tools, analysis, etc. There's a bridging function where companies need help. The other problem set is at the government or agency level, and it's two parts. Again, the scarcity of talent comes into play. There's only so many people within this country that understand how to implement these things well, and to have various agencies fighting over those people or accessing because of need more junior people to try and implement these things, that creates a challenge. And then the second piece is the coordination across federal, provincial, local activity, so that redundancy is eliminated, common purpose is achieved. Those are some challenges that need to be addressed. So that is what I see in terms of the policy perspective. There's some great things going underway, in particular on the funding standpoint. A number of different pools of money being made available to companies. A good start on the education front. We've launched our education program. There's other things ongoing. IRAP has their advisory programs, for example. The Elevate IP funding is there to help build that out in some other cases. And then on the time to build piece, that I think still needs some work. We're building out our collective patent portfolio, which is a step in that direction. But there's been more limited activity, I think, on that piece.
I know there's also an IP village, which is a bit of a loose coordination, with CIPO and ISED and BDC. So making good headway, but a bit to go. So Graeme, your thoughts, and that actually will segue well actually into the Q&A time. I know Laura's posted a question in the chat about that exact piece, Mike. So maybe you can have a look at the question while Graeme gives his thoughts on policy support he would look for.
I think Mike's points are very, very well made and very well organized, and certainly I'm very heartened to see the increased focus at multiple levels of government and policy in Canada on increasing those three prime areas that are needed in order to increase the sophistication of Canadian intellectual property strategy, building on some of the strengths that have existed in relatively small numbers of Canadian companies that have been truly successful with their IP strategies. I wouldn't offer a great deal of expertise in terms of building those policies specifically, but I can comment maybe just briefly on a couple of things that I see as very positive, and a couple of things I think could be potentially helpful from the perspective of a small, relatively small and scaling technology company. One is certainly the thought put more specifically to ensuring that companies participating in development grants are having thought to IP planning and IP strategy, and that those IP strategy frameworks are part of the funding arrangements, collaborations, and consortia agreements that are built into those funding networks. I think it's a very positive step. I definitely recognize the Digital Supercluster for their approach to ensuring that participants in project funding have those types of planning in place, and the attempt to follow up and make sure that that is an active part of how participants are conducting projects with consideration of IP rights. I think that it would be helpful given the number of types of programs to ensure that that type of approach of ensuring companies are planning for intellectual property rights and have at least a minimum level of strategy in place is great. I think that recognition that IP development costs are a significant part of small companies' costs in building technology. Recognition of that cost as part of the grant funding criteria, and allowing for implementation of those IP strategies as fundable parts of project scope is definitely something that would make that alignment even more likely to result in positive benefits to the outcome of those funded projects. Definitely, I think that the attention at multiple levels of government to try and align in terms of policy direction is also really important. Everybody identifying, intellectual property as an important part of building a knowledge-based economy is great, but like Mike mentioned, ensuring that those efforts, staff, initiatives, and requirements aren't duplicative or at least at best well aligned, I think is also very important. There's a lot to manage as a small company when you're working through projects with policy criteria, and certainly the better aligned those are, the more likely it is to result in the intended effect of increasing IP strategy and strength of IP results.
That's great. Thank you. And I will say, just being involved with, several of the programs over the years, there is a common interest in all the groups collaborating. I know, Mike, you and I have been on many calls with other government groups, and it's like, how do we all work together? So I think we're moving that direction, but so we'll see where the next year goes. But maybe we can shift to kind of a Q&A. I see there's a couple of open questions we can get to, but maybe actually Laura asked a great question. It's in the chat about early stage protection with no budgets, and I think, Mike, that's that gap you talked about. And I know we're talking about getting ready for scale up, but if I flip the question around, if you're a startup or early stage with little budget and you're trying to prepare for scale up, what's briefly one or two things you can think through? And Graeme, happy to chime in as well.
How can you describe your market value and your approach without revealing your secret sauce, right? What level of detail? There is a level of detail that you should be comfortable with, right? You can't keep everything secret and expect people to give you money. But there's a line somewhere in there where passing it is dangerous for you. So getting a feel for where that line is, what is enough that is sufficient to justify a grant or an investment or a sale, without giving away the details until you have the details protected. And again, you need the catch-22, you need the funding to pursue the protection, but there's a line there that you need to explore and get and understand. So that's first. And I think the more money you're pursuing, that line shifts, right? Smaller amounts of money, you can disclose less. More money, you're going to have to get comfortable with disclosing a bit more. All right, and then there's a stage where you've received some money and you need to invest in that protection before you start to disclose more information or to more people. So that would be, I think, core to my advice there. There are a large number of programs available right now to help with that. We're providing funding. IRAP has funding available. The Trade Commissioner's Office has funding available for foreign filings, for example. So there's a lot of capital available for you to help get that process started.
Maybe if I can jump to another question. I think if I hit answer live, Jen, will that? I'm not sure where it shows up. But there's and Graeme, I'll maybe turn to you because it's a bit of a talent question, right? It's about a technology patent engineer, and he or she is commenting that there's a trend to hire IP analysts or patent engineers to draft patents. And if you're building, I can give my thoughts. I'd like to get your thoughts. I'll maybe start with mine. My view is you have to think about the talent of your whole team, right? And having a high-priced patent engineer high-priced patent agent on staff is great, but they can't do everything. And having patent engineers doing the heavy lift, but having good oversight, not necessarily finishing the drafting, but getting the bulk of the work done has always been a success for many clients I've worked with, as well as in my past when I worked for corporate. I've often used to say to the engineers I worked with when I worked for corporate that I only actually need a day of your time because I've got some patent engineers that'll do the heavy lift, and they were always very happy to not be pulled away from the R&D project. So it was best of both worlds. We got prices down. So my experience is it just has to be a bit of a balance, but there's a place for the heavy lift being done by non-patent agents if they are skilled and they have good oversight. But Graeme, your thoughts and practice as well would be great.
I think that is very much the case, particularly if you are able to identify someone who's part of the technical team that is an inventor close to it or close to the inventions. When you're talking about patents, at least, that is also can have their interest cultivated in that patent analyst or patent engineer function of being able to work at describing it and understanding the basic concepts of patent writing to be able to produce that first level of lift. I think also is important is ensuring that that person is as well coordinated as possible with whatever external consultant or IP professionals work that you're employing, to ensure that they're learning as fast as possible, that they're getting that feedback, that they're seeing the where the initial drafts and information they're collecting is going and how it's being leveraged into a more complete or finished patent application. Because the idea, of course, is developing talent while they're performing that function is certainly going to give you much more scalable results in building that in-house and capability without necessarily having to immediately hire a senior professional to oversee the process in-house.
Yeah, if maybe I can add one point, I think if an organization has context and clarity on the type of portfolio they want to build, and when I say portfolio, I actually mean patents, trademarks, trade secrets, like the whole thing, there can actually be having, a patent engineer that's got enough understanding of the business can actually make sure the specification and the first draft is shaped well enough that it takes into account the business, because they know what they need to protect. The engineer can come in, the inventor can come in, make sure there's technical accuracy and overlap, and then the patent agent can come in to make sure there's legal protection. I often say the three assets you need in a room to draft a good patent is a business person, a technical person, and a legal person. And if you have those three minds in a room, you can craft something very, very that has good value for the business.
I would just add
Go ahead.
one step to that I started my career as a patent analyst. I think it's a very valuable role within an organization. And again, you talk to the ability to create leverage with a more experienced or credentialed professional. But I think it gives you multiple career paths within IP as well, right? You can continue down that path and become subject matter expert around the technology and allow you to enable filing of better patent claims, to do due diligence on potential assets under consideration for a transaction, or to support building out claim charts for an enforcement action. There's a more data analytics piece, right? Looking at larger data sets and understanding how to parse and organize that information. You can move in that direction. There's a deal or transaction support piece, so becoming more on the negotiation side as you build out your expertise. And there's a strategy side. That's where my career was in that direction. That's what interested me. Or yes, we pursue my interests more in the securing of rights, and I end up becoming a patent agent or a patent attorney, and I progress through those credentials. So I think it's as an individual, a great point to start your career, and within an organization, a very valuable role.
Great. Well, I know we have a few questions, and maybe what I can do is pause and turn it back over to Jen. I want to make sure we finish on time because everyone's in the world of back-to-back Zoom calls. So, but I wanted to thank Graeme and Mike for your comments, and Jen and the Supercluster, thank you for inviting us today. And if there's some follow-up questions and resources, maybe the Supercluster can send out some final comments on our behalf via email.
Thank you. And I just, before we hand off, I actually have a question sort of for all three of you. A thread that has come through all of this, and you've all nailed it at the very end and sort of throughout as well, is around sort of this education, this talent piece. And I think, you've struck it from, the levels of within an organization and the different sort of assets that are out there for learning. The CG MOOC is another one, for example, that can really sort of help with some foundational knowledge. But I'm curious about your thoughts. If we're really looking at, sort of from a competitive advantage, from an ecosystem, not sort of just individually or organizationally, but nationally, globally, that we strip that and go even a layer up, that there is a necessity, or are your thoughts that there is sort of a IP foundation sort of skill set toolkit that goes way back before sort of, one enters even the workforce. So, akin to something like coding has become, for kids, is that how far back can we start to build this mindset? Because regardless of pathway, how empowered they'll be. So I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
I think you need to go in two directions from the piece you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So early stage, yes, appreciation and understanding of IP. And you see a lot of countries, including China, starting to build that into their early stage education systems. K-12, right? How is that introduced in Europe? That's a big issue right now of how do they introduce IP concepts into those pieces. But on the flip side, and I think more importantly right now, right, you mentioned the CG MOOC, great introductory foundational piece, but we don't need there's foundational material available. How do we take early stage professionals and build them out to become experts, become world leaders that can drive companies forward. What are the gaps in education in terms of understanding how to build strategy, how to analyze a patent set, how to create leverage against companies, how to use that within a business? That's the biggest gap right now, and that's what needs to be filled.
I agree. Graeme, any 10-second wrap up?
10 seconds.
Absolutely. I think that
we start a new education strategy here. I love it.
Exactly. I think starting in the school level, definitely in university for researchers and technical people and taking technical degrees of any kind, understanding that IP research is one of those skills in addition to academic research that really helps you understand the field of development that you're working in better, and building that into technical education across the spectrum would be a great benefit to a groundswell of IP awareness through the people that are going to be the ones making inventions in the future.
Perfect. Thank you. You've inspired me. I'll leave it to Annika now to close us out and inspire the others. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just quickly to everyone, as mentioned in the chat, we will be sending out all of the links mentioned today, as well as additional resources in the follow-up email. And a huge thank you to Graeme, Peter, and Mike for sharing their expertise and knowledge with us today. It was really valuable for our members. Stay tuned for our next webinar next month, and thank you all for joining us today.